Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you for this invitation to talk about this subject, which is very close to my heart. At present, I am on vacation on the Isle of Skye, and in a hotel room, and it's about 8 p.m. and and my young dog is here as well. So if I'm slightly distracted at times, it may be that he is distracting me, but generally he's very good in these situations. Um, and yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk about this area. So I'm going to start with an introduction and a bit of history, the political context around the land reform process and the recent land reform history in Scotland. What's really interesting, I think, is the creation of new community rights to buy land and to own land, and in a way that challenges our concepts of ownership as much as it does about land and intergenerational justice around land. So the talk hopefully will be a mixture of a bit of storytelling and a bit of technical law. And the slides are intended to help guide a story rather than get lost in the technical legal details. Although those will certainly be accessible from my writing if you want to look at that. Some of what I'm going to say now is part of the text that is in a book that will be published in 2022, a Cornell Press publication. I think the title is The Social Life of Land, and that has case studies around land, not always land reform, but land processes in lots of different contexts. And it was part of a group led by some US scholars, notably Wendy Walford and Nancy Pelusi. Okay, so let me begin the talk then, if you're all ready for me to do so. So I would say that this paper could be called New Community Rights to Own Land, or Dances with Lairds, Lessons from Scottish Land Reform. So I begin. Long neglected as a governance concern, the protection of community land rights is perhaps on the rise globally. In this talk, I take a closer look at the process in Scotland, where in 2013, the Scottish Government, or the First Minister, Alex Salmond at the time, made a commitment to transfer 1 million acres of land into community ownership by 2020. In 2015 and 2016, the Scottish Parliament then passed legislation strengthening community rights to buy land, with promises of more legislation and more law to facilitate this on the way. Government commitments to community ownership of land are not unusual in some parts of the world, and the formal recognition of community lands has increased in recent decades. However, for developed countries, this is less common, and therefore the Scottish case does buck the normal trend. Here I will explain some of the content of these community rights, and also look at, and although we don't have enough time to look at it fully, look at the factors that enabled this law to take place, to occur. What makes the Scottish example unusual is the facilitation of community rights in law. The new community rights provisions challenge a seemingly intransigent area of law, and that is the protection of private property rights. My work here seeks to understand the socio-cultural and the institutional conditions that enabled the new legal provisions to occur. It also explores the significance of the Scottish for the trajectory of collective as opposed to individual rights and land rights, particularly globally. So we're still on the first slide. In 2013, the then First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, took to a podium at the Community Land Scotland conference at the Gaelic College on Skye, where I am actually now. And Community Land Scotland is an NGO which works to support community land groups around Scotland, groups who are buying community land, who have obtained community land, and who are trying to democratise the processes around participation in land decisions. So at the Gaelic College here on Skye, he made the announcement. He announced a commitment to transfer 1 million acres of land into community ownership by 2020. And although that may not sound so much in Canada, it is a dramatic figure in Scotland. He envisaged a radical reshaping of the right to buy landscape that has the potential to transform the fortunes of communities across the country in order to achieve shared aspirations, new jobs, new amenities in areas long denied new jobs, and the regeneration and the repopulation of communities across Scotland. The community land vision was part of a wider governmental commitment to radical and ambitious land reform in Scotland. Notwithstanding much chagrin and much opposition from dominant landowners, the lairds, as we call them, and their representatives, this commitment led to a significant change in land governance in Scotland, including the creation of new sets of rights to enable communities to buy land in Scotland. Although that process had started in earlier legislation, it facilitated the extension of those community rights. So community rights to buy land and obligations to consult local communities in planning decisions are now embedded in this legislation, the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003, the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015, and the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016. This legislation creates new community rights to own land and other assets in Scotland, and with some optimism, this may be viewed as part of an upward curve towards legal protection of community rights globally. So, to consider Scotland's community land within the global context, we could say that more than 50% of the world's land is registered as community land, and as many as 2.5 billion people depend on community lands for their livelihood, according to the Rights and Resources Institute 2017. Estimates from 2015 suggest that only just over 10% of collectively owned land is estimated to be formally recognised as collectively owned land by the state, by their governments. More up-to-date data is not available, and the precise amount of collectively owned land may be much larger. Further, not all legally recognised community land is registered and documented, and in many countries, national laws do not recognise collectively held land or hold an accurate land register or establish a formalisation procedure or have established a formalisation procedure to recognise community lands. And I have to say that in general, finding data on community land globally, customary land or collectively owned land is very difficult, and landmark.org it seems to be the main source of data and mapping on this, and it does a great job, but there's so much more to be done. I will leave it at that. And I think when we're talking about context and talking also to the NFU Canada, it's important to recognise the pressure of land for agriculture and food production as having been a key driver that has created a scramble for the acquisition of land for farmland, particularly where land suitable for cultivation and water are abundant, where labour is cheap, and where access to global markets is relatively easy. and that work has been documented by Olivier de Schutter when he was in the role of UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Food. And so his reports from around 2011 document this the global farm race, a race for to accumulate land to use it as farmland. Okay. So against this ever-changing global landscape, here I focus on the new provisions in Scotland as a possible pathway out of the steel grip of markets that prioritise property rights over human rights, over community rights, and over the environment. Although aspects of this pathway are specific to Scotland, as I'll make it onto, every state and constitution is unique. Therefore, Scotland is no more unique than any other territory in some ways, and it should not be viewed as an outlier or necessarily as a one-off. That said, the provisions do not provide a blueprint, but rather some hope that the primacy of individual property rights within legal systems can be challenged and somewhat reordered where democracy and the rule of law prevail. So I will consider how the new community land laws came into effect. In particular, I'm thinking about social, political and governance features in the Scottish land reform process. The success of these new legal provisions to date in effecting transfers of land into community ownership is described in numbers and a few examples. But it's the process rather than the outcome that I think is most interesting for land reform processes globally. So I've got this funny old poster up now as the first slide, and this is intended to depict history in Scotland, but it's also a little bit tongue-in-cheek because it's also a false representation, perhaps, of history and a false romanticisation of Scotland's history, as I will explain now. So Scotland differs markedly from other European countries, where typically the bulk of a country's land is owned by a very large number of people, and where extensive estates of the Scottish sort are few or non-existent. So Scotland has these large estates, large areas of land which are owned by a single landowner. In order to understand the Scottish land reform movement today, one needs to know the origins of the crofting tenure and how land ownership in the Highlands and Islands came to be concentrated in the way that it now is. The history of clans and crofts has been recounted many times over and popularised by works of art such as Braveheart and Outlander. The well-kent story that goes that prior to the union of Scotland and England in 1707, the Highlanders were left largely to their own devices and were organised by clans, depicted in this image. The vision of the Gaelic society was that the clan owned the land, and that the laird was the clan leader. Our Scottish historian James Hunter describes the bonds of kinship and mutual obligation on which clans were based, and which effectively precluded the introduction of the impersonal money relationships. By the mid-18th century, the Highlanders began to follow the example set by their southern neighbours, and the clan chiefs began to conform to a new form of property rights, feudal tenure. This introduced monetary relationships, and these were then established in the Highlands and Islands, and the title laird shifted from leader of the clan to landowner, and the crofting system then emerged. This was a time of great instability in Scotland. No sooner than the crofting system was established than the infamous Highland Clearances began. Landowners became driven by profit and quickly used sheep farming to generate wool and kelping which is using sea kelp and seaweed from the seashore, would be more profitable than tenanting land to crofters. Vast parts of land were cleared, and hundreds of townships across the crofting communities became a redundant population and were moved not just to other parts of that rural territory, but to less fertile ground, or off of the rural territory altogether. These were known as the clearances, and they continued for a century, and the introduction of intensive sheep farming has had severe social and ecological implications in the Highlands and Islands. So if we move to the next slide, this is also a romantic image of Scotland, the monarch of the Glen. Throughout the 20th century, Scotland was represented as a utopian hinterland whereby, as one of our writers, Mary McFadyen, put it so eloquently, once regarded as backwards and coarse peoples of a primitive world, the Highlanders were rapidly transformed in the romantic imagination of an international elite into brave and virile warriors, bonny lassies, docile labourers, melancholic folk, proud, orderly clans, and many combinations of these. In the context of the Industrial Revolution, the landscape stood in for an ongoing fantasy of better times, almost always linked to an organically arranged social world of beauty, cooperation, and honour. And as the writer Mary McFadyen put it, this provided not only a psychological escape from contemporary reality, but also an escape from the history of Scotland itself. And this brought a certain harm, this misrepresentation brought harm, and it wreaked havoc on the public's ability to not only know the story of their own place, but also on their ability to imagine progressive and democratic alternatives. So, for those who know this history, this is a phony romanticism of Scotland that is immortalised in the many portraits of a solitary brazen braw stag on a barren hill, i.e., the monarch of the Glen. These paintings of the stag, and the stag represents the cultivation of the estates in the Scottish Highlands, the estates that cleared the people and the crofters and the vegetation from the land to make way for large sporting estates. The estates were and still are privately owned, do a roaring trade with visiting aristocracy, and for most buyers, an estate represents, as one newspaper put it recently, a luxury purchase to enjoy, not unlike a super yacht or a Lamborghini. If we move to the next slide, this shows a barren. This image can sometimes be presented as a wild, windswept mountain, but in fact it is a barren, desolate, ecological wasteland that should be forested, and which represents declining soil fertility, and these sites are now subject of moves and campaigns for rewilding, so replanting of trees, but that brings certain that can be quite difficult when there's a strong deer population to get the trees established. So for a long time, therefore, the high concentration of land ownership in Scotland, i.e. where land is owned by a very small number of people, was a permanent and inadvertently fetishised fixture of the Scottish landscape, and it was often hidden from view or misunderstood as places of wilderness. So this barren landscape in the Highlands and Islands and these depleted communities, empty communities, are a source of injustice rather than a source of pride in a way. So this changed. If we move to the next slide, this changed. Our understanding and engagement with these places began to change in a widespread mainstream way around the early 2000s. And an emerging popular demand for land reform was fueled by an understanding of a backstory around the clearances, and this propelled the possibility of change. So greater understanding of the relationship between the extreme wealth of the estates and extreme poverty elsewhere in Scotland. This was seeded through this work by Andy Whiteman. He published this book, Who Owns Scotland and The Poor Had No Lawyers, and around that time. And these became cult books, and they received more attention, particularly around the rise of the Scottish independence movement in 2014 and the referendum in 2014. Okay, so let me just check where we are with the slides. Great. So that was the previous slide, the slide of the black and white slide. And let me just check, are we a wee bit ahead on the slides? Great. Okay, so this is the book that I think is a landmark text, and now this is the right slide to be on, Scottish land ownership. Okay, great. So here we see the concentration of land ownership in Scotland. So whilst the recent land reform legislation and vision may be considered exceptional, especially externally, from a wider lens, Scotland is behind the curve because Scotland has this intensely concentrated pattern of ownership. In his book in 2010, Andy Whiteman gave the staggering statistic that 50% of privately owned rural land in Scotland is owned by 432 landowners. And this statistic is commonly quoted and has travelled far and wide. A research review published alongside the Land Commission's most recent investigation, provides more texture to Whiteman's statistic. In 2014, 1,125 estates were estimated to control about 70% of privately owned rural land in Scotland. And 667 of these estates were between 1,000 and 10,000 hectares in size, and 87 were larger than 10,000 hectares. That's according to research led by Jane Glass in 2019 for the Scottish Land Commission. There is a strong preference amongst the owners of large estates then to pass the land on to their heirs, and succession law in Scotland has generally allowed estates to stay intact as a complete territory, suggesting that the long-term pattern of low turnover in estates is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. In this way, Scotland differs markedly from other European countries where typically the bulk of a country's land is owned by very large numbers of people, and where extensive estates of the Scottish sort are few or non-existent, as I said earlier. So against this backdrop of entrenched land ownership and consolidated land ownership, Salmon's speech on Skye and the effective revision of property rights which happened thereafter is all the more significant. What follows explains the mechanics of new community rights to buy and own land, which the Scottish Government introduced to facilitate the transition to community ownership. So let's see where we are with the slides. Could you move to the next slide, please, Suleiman? Okay, sorry, that's the wrong slide. Please continue to the next slide. Okay, so a slight detour here to say that this is the island of Egg in the Hebrides in Scotland, and this is considered to be the forerunner of community ownership because the history here is remarkable in that the community, before the legislation was in place, they arranged to buy the land off of the landowner at that time. And it was a very small group of people, and they showed how a community can gather together to buy an island. If you move to the next slide. And here we see the group who moved to that island, who were essentially servants to the landowner on that island, and who led this remarkable campaign to buy the island off of the landowner. And they did so through essentially encouraging the landowner to support them in this campaign. Okay, next slide. But this was a forerunner, and it was before the legislation, the infrastructure which was created. Okay, so this slide depicts a committee room within the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish Parliament is this beautiful building designed by a Catalan architect, Miralles, Eric Miralles, and this room is considered to represent being inside of the mountain and to represent a gathering place inside the mountain, and the whole of the Scottish Parliament is designed to sort of be of the earth and almost have come straight out of the rock. And in the main plenary of the Parliament, there is a gallery which depicts gatherings on the hillside for the public to attend. So it's a beautiful building, and a setting kind of fit for thinking through representing the population and democratising decision making. A modern European Parliament. That was how it was envisaged. So the Scottish Government proposed new land legislation containing a set of rights to buy land through the Land Reform Act 2003, which included a community right to buy land when it comes on the market, and an absolute crofting community right to buy land. And the 2003 community rights to buy only apply if there is a willing seller, in which case the community right is one of first refusal. The next wave of rights from the Community Empowerment Scotland Act and the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 create community rights to buy land even where there is not a willing seller, i.e. against the present owner's wishes. So that is a fundamental shift. And Egg is an example where eventually they were able to buy the land with the present owner's wishes, in alignment with the present owner's wishes. But in order to transfer land from landowners to communities, when the landowner does not want necessarily to support the community, is the next development. And what this legislation does is it gives the community a priority right to win the bid to buy the land. So the 2015 Act introduced a community right to buy abandoned, neglected or detrimental land. And this was done through amending part of the 2003 Act, effectively extending a pre-existing right to buy land when the owner was willing, to allow communities to intervene and to buy abandoned, neglected or detrimental land. And then the 2006 new community right enables communities to buy land to further sustainable development. And this provision came into force in the Act was passed in 2016, but the provision didn't come into force until 2020. And where it is successfully used, this right will lead to community ownership of land, irrespective of whether the owner is willing to sell the land to the community. In other words, a community body that successfully exercises their right under this will have an absolute right to buy land if they can demonstrate that the community acquisition will help achieve sustainable development on the land. The Act, so a lot hinges then on the definition of sustainable development, and the Act does not include a definition of sustainable development, but it states that sustainable development conditions are met if A, the transfer of land is likely to further the achievement of sustainable development in relation to the land, B, the transfer of land is in the public interest. C, the transfer of land is likely to result in significant benefit to the relevant community to which the application relates. And 2, is the only practical or the most practical way of achieving that significant benefit. And D, not granting consent to the transfer of land is likely to result in harm to that community. So to exercise these rights to buy, there must be an eligible community. That eligible community must be incorporated into a community body, and in the legislation, community is defined on a geographical basis, so it could not be a community of interest. It has to be geographically based, and that can be defined by postcodes or a prescribed area or region. This definition of community has been chosen to reflect the importance of place, reflected within current Scottish Government policy and current legislation, as well as the implicit aims or objectives of the original land reform targets, which was repopulation of these areas, so to bring people back to place. The legislation states that a relevant community body must have a number of essential characteristics which collectively ensure that community-owned assets are used for the benefit of the wider community rather than one particular interest group. And the community body should have a clear definition of the geographical community. It should have a membership open to any member of that geographical community. It must be locally led and controlled. It must have as its main purpose the furthering of sustainable development in the local area. It must be non-profit distributing, and it must have evidence to demonstrate a sufficient level of support and community buy-in. And that's not to say that there cannot be profit distributing activity on that land. Let's see where we are with the slides. Brilliant. Thank you, Suleiman. Sorry, I'm not being that good at guiding us through the slides. Then there's some more technicality around ownership, how ownership is defined. It's defined in the legal sense as a legal title coupled with an exclusive legal right to possession. And while communities can lease or manage and jointly own assets, it was agreed that for the purposes of achieving the target, the definition should be restricted to outright ownership rather than managing or leasing land. Furthermore, another condition for the community body is that it must explain the reasons why it considers that the land is either wholly or mainly neglected or abandoned, or how it is causing harm. And that is relevant whether they are buying it for sustainable development or buying it because it is abandoned. And then there's some procedural requirements about informing the landowner and other relevant parties of their application to buy this. So let's see the next slide, please. Okay, so this slide demonstrates the rising number of community ownership buyouts. It could do with a little bit of an update. I'm not sure if the Land Fund has an update yet. So this demonstrates that community groups now own land parcels across Scotland. As of December 2008, there were 593 assets in community ownership, and these were owned by 429 community groups, and that amounted to 209,000 hectares. These stats do need a little bit of an update, but not too much actually. And as this question has come up before, I will put in the detail here that the process for determining the price of the assets for sale is set out in various provisions in the legislation. The process is as follows. The Scottish ministers, so the Scottish elected representatives in the Parliament, appoint a suitably qualified valuer. The valuer shall invite the owner of the land and the community body to make written representations about what they think the value of the land and any property on it is. And then the valuer shall consider these representations and try to reach an agreement. If the parties cannot agree on the valuation, they can appeal to the land court to challenge the valuation. So, in short, it is not easy for the seller of the land to refute the independent land valuation. And if we move to the next slide, please. Okay, so here are some examples of community acquisitions. The first one here is the island of Alva, and it's on the Inner Hebrides on the west coast of Scotland, and a local group there called the Northwest Mull Community Woodland Company received an unprecedented award of 4.4 million to buy the land from the previous private owner. So where did they receive that money from? They received that money from the Scottish Land Fund, which is a body which the Scottish Government created and which receives funds to subsidise the buying of land. So when the community wanted to buy this land, they could not afford the independent valuer's price. They applied to the Scottish Land Fund for money to enable them to buy it, to assist that transfer of land. And it was previously capped at around 1 million per application. But in this case, the Land Fund thought it was justifiable to grant them the 4.4 million in order to buy it. Let's move to the next slide, please. This is an urban buyout. It is Portobello Old Parish Church in Edinburgh. A local group called Action Porty was awarded 647,000 from the Scottish Land Fund to buy the church and the halls, and it was considered the first urban community buyout, and it serves a range of community needs in the urban area, with dance classes, workshops, childcare, concerts and various cultural activities that occur in there. Let's move to the next one, please. So a very special place, the Arden Lighthouse, the most westerly point in Scotland, and I have to credit this photo to Michael McGregor. And this was a lighthouse buyout, which is quite unusual, and a local group called Ardmurchan Lighthouse Trust was awarded 224,000 from the Scottish Land Fund to buy a lighthouse and to run a cafe on it and to use it as a heritage site as much as anything else. So another point to say is that not all transfers are from private owners. Sometimes they are from public bodies such as councils, or from quasi-public bodies such as the Church, the Church of Scotland or the Church of England or another church body. And and that's represented in those examples. So I know that we're running out of time, so let's see. I would say now that the questions remain as to what led this political demand for land reform, and how was it successful within such a kind of property rights dominated culture. And this slide represents the rise of community owned land. So in 1990 it was at almost 40,000 hectares, and now it's up to over 200,000 hectares across Scotland, and most of that is in the Highland region. I'm not sure why we're zooming in on the slide, but that's okay. So previous attempts at land reform in Scotland were often piecemeal or thwarted by private property interests, and it was only really when the Scottish Parliament began to engage with political demand around community rights that a real momentum began to build around the passage of this legislation in Parliament. So in order to understand it, we need to look at the cultural context and also the institutional landscape that enabled the change. And a key element of this, a key enabling factor, was the existence of the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, and designed by Enrique Morales, and the way that Parliament represents a new style of democracy, which is intended to be inclusive and kind of circular in its design and in its thinking, as opposed to adversarial, which is how the Westminster Parliament was designed. And a key feature of the Scottish Parliament is that human rights are central to the constitution of the Scottish Parliament. They're embedded in the Scotland Act, and these are constitutional details through which the Scottish Parliament distinguishes itself, or attempts to distinguish itself from the UK Parliament in debates and in decision making. Therefore, by aligning more with the human rights framework, the Scottish Parliament fulfills its constitutional document, and that's its guiding star. Therefore, by making the human rights argument for land reform, it propelled the decision makers within Parliament to act on it with more haste and with more determination. So I'll finish by saying these developments in the Scottish context are not a silver bullet, and land use decisions remain problematic, with new clashes emerging all the time now between rewilding and repopulating these Highland and Island regions, and between using land for carbon storage and land for homes or land for food security. But new alliances between land activists and human rights activists and advocates, and growing recognition of the relationship between land rights and human rights, has brought strength to finding alternatives to the prevailing system of private property rights. And those alternatives have long been established elsewhere in parts of the world that we may broadly describe as the global south, particularly in South America, where collectively owned land is a majority of the land. But the Scotland story is not necessarily a template that can be easily replicated, but it does speak to new possibilities in the global north. So thank you very much, and sorry that the slides were slightly difficult to match. At the end here, I've put on 2 slides, which was sort of to relate this talk to the farming situation. So if we just go back up 1 slide, please. And this is a fairly recent report. I think it was 2019, from the Scottish Farm Trust, which outlined that land is still in short supply for new farmers, and these community rights have not had much impact on creating new areas of agricultural land. There's a variety of reasons when you think about it around the technicalities of the community definition. So it may be very difficult to find a community that is wholly invested in creating farmland, and it for various reasons there hasn't been much agricultural land which has shifted into community ownership. And this report states that it's still very hard for new entrants to the farming system to find land, and their biggest obstacle is access to land. And that is outlined in that next slide, which is quite hard to read, sorry, but it just says that 71% noted that access to land was a significant barrier. And then second to that was to find housing on land near their farm. Okay, so on that note, I'd like to conclude and say thank you very much for listening, and really just the beginning of the discussion. Please contact me again if you'd like to discuss any of this, and yeah, thank you for your attention.
Yeah.